Welcome back to the State of the Arc podcast. My name is Mike.
My name's Kaysen.
This is the first episode of our Final Fantasy X podcast series.
Can't believe it.
It finally won. It was a close call between Final Fantasy X and Chrono Cross. It would have been interesting to do Chrono Cross now because by the time this goes live, I think the remaster is either going to be coming out in a week or will be on the same week.
Yeah.
But it's been a long-standing tradition since the beginning of this podcast about a year ago that FF10 just loses to things and loses and loses and loses, and
Which
people are getting mad.
If we were to ask most of the people who follow this channel, what's your favorite game?
Yeah.
FF10 would probably be the
high.
top.
Yeah.
Well, top 2 or 3. But
Yeah.
for whatever reason, in the specific pairings of the polls, it was like number 2 every single time.
It just wouldn't win. And
wouldn't
so
win.
this
Couldn't do
time, it won.
Yeah.
And I'm very excited to talk about it because this is a game I've been wanting. Like, I've had a sort of an itch to revisit for a while. I hadn't played it since I did my original sort of like retrospective review on it back in, I think, 2016 or something like that.
I first played it in probably like 2018.
Yeah,
That was
so
my first time.
it's been about 5 or 6 years, somewhere around there, since I've played it. And I've been talking about this with the patrons that I stream with. There are certain things I had opinions about that they were, kind of asking me about now. Do you still feel this way? What about this? What about that? And it's like, well, it's been so long since I've played this that maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe there's something I missed. So I'm kind of keeping an eye on very specific things this time. And so, just keep that in mind as we're talking. We're going to be reevaluating the story. But, and I always have to do this when we first start a new podcast, if you're new, so say you've never seen our podcast before, what we do with this is we're analyzing the story specifically.
Particularly, yeah.
Not so much the gameplay mechanics, though we will bring those up time to time. But this is a storytelling analysis podcast on video game stories. And the way that we try to handle this is something like a video game book club. Where you play along with us, and have you not played the game before, say this is your first time, you will have the opportunity to do so without being spoiled on late game events now. So we're only going to
So long as you don't read the comments.
Yes, avoid the comments. But we're not going, the place we played up for today, though I don't think we'll get to it.
No.
Is up through
I'd be surprised.
when you first arrive at the Kilika Temple.
Yeah.
That's where we played up to, but I think we're going to probably only get up to maybe just the beginning scene, the first scene where Tidus gets taken from Xanarkand into Spira.
Like just the first 15 minutes.
I suspect that's probably where we'll stop today. But that being said, we're not going to talk about anything that happens after Kilika Temple now.
Yeah.
So don't worry about spoilers, unless we specifically call it out. We'll call it out when it's necessary to do so.
And then we'll give you time codes and all that
Exactly.
stuff.
So play along with us if you've never played this game before, or if you'd like to replay it. That is where we played up to for this week. So that's probably the first 4-ish hours of the game or something like that.
Yeah, somewhere in there.
Okay, so without further ado, the next thing we typically like to do before we get started jumping right into the story is to look a little bit into the development history of these games and try to get a handle on where the creators were coming from when they made it. So what were they thinking? What were their ambitions and their goals? I like to do that before sort of like forming an opinion on something, because to me it's more important to understand what was the creator's intention with this.
Yeah.
Did they achieve that or not, regardless of whether I like that choice?
Exactly.
Was that what they were trying to do?
So analyze it based on what it purports to be instead of what you wanted it to be.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So we're going to jump into that first. For the first probably like 30 minutes or so, we'll kind of go over some of that.
Okay.
So I like to start with key developers.
FF8?
Yes.
Team FF8?
This is basically the same leadership and key developers as was on Final Fantasy VIII. So if you have not seen our Final Fantasy VIII podcast series, there's a lot of history with these particular people that you can find there that I will not reiterate today. about some of the friction that was going on behind the scenes on the Final Fantasy team between Yoshinori Kitase, Tetsuya Nomura, even Tetsuya Takahashi, who went on to make Xenogears,
and Sakaguchi,
and
who
Hironobu Sakaguchi.
felt like he was losing control of it a
Right,
little. Right.
the creator of Final Fantasy,
Yeah.
who had very different ideas about where they should take the series in
what it's supposed to be.
the 3D era.
Yeah.
It's like, how should this look? What kind of world should we make? How should the design philosophy go? How should we change or keep the formula of Final Fantasy that had been established on the NES and Super NES? And they disagreed on this a lot.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening is that after Final Fantasy VII, they kind of split into teams, and
Yeah.
there were like a lot of different teams making Final Fantasy games at the same time. So after Final Fantasy VIII finished, they had Final Fantasy IX, 10, 11, and for part of the development, 12, and Spirits Within.
At the same time.
All being made at the same time.
Yes, that's right, Spirits Within. Yes.
So the movie and
Yes.
FF9 were kind of spearheaded by Sakaguchi. Final Fantasy X, right on the coattails of 8,
Yep.
was being produced by this team, Yoshinori Kitase's team. And then he had Matsuno, who made Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story. Off the back of Vagrant Story, started to work on 12.
12, yeah.
He was in the early pre-production stage. You know, its full development didn't start till after 10 was released. But
Yeah.
and Final Fantasy XI was headed by Hiromichi Tanaka, who had come into the company with Sakaguchi and had not worked on Final Fantasy since 3. He went on to kind of produce and headline the Mana series
Oh, that's right. That's
and
right.
some other things. But this was his first time coming back to Final Fantasy, was on 11. So they had all these projects going on at once. Final Fantasy was no longer just a single team headed by Sakaguchi.
Yeah.
It was a bunch of teams that had a bunch of different ideas about what Final Fantasy is or should be made. And so you started to see very different styles post Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah.
So, anyways, a lot more of that is discussed in the FF8 podcast. I encourage you to watch that if you want to learn more about that history. But that being said, Final Fantasy X was in development by the same team that did FF8. So this is producer and director Yoshinori Kitase, who came into Square during the production of FF4, got his real start doing event scene direction on 5, and worked very closely with Sakaguchi, and then directed 6, 7, and 8. So, and he is the one who's kind of like the executive producer now of the Final Fantasy series.
Yeah, of like 7 Remake and 15.
Yeah. And so his team is essentially what makes up what they have now in Square's Creative Unit Division 1, or Creative Business Unit 1, I think is what it's called. And yeah, so they're the ones heading the Final Fantasy VII Remake project. They were the ones who did the Final Fantasy 13 trilogy. They did this game, Final Fantasy X. So a lot of these developers are that division of Square, right? Then you have, like, say, Creative Business Unit 3 in Square now, who does Final Fantasy 14 and the upcoming Final Fantasy 16.
Yeah.
So if you were not aware of this, these are very different teams with very different creators, and that's why Final Fantasy feels really different between a lot of its entries, right? So anyways, we talked a lot in the FF8 podcast about this team's style.
Yep.
So again, I'll just point you in that direction if you want to hear more about that. But Yoshinori Kitase directed FF10. Here were some of the lead designers. This is probably the first time that we have talked about Motomo Toriyama.
Yeah, did events and
So
things,
he had been kind of an event planner or event scripter on all the way back to like FF7, really. If I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure this is right. He handled like the wall market, like Bumblebee Inn sort of like section of Final Fantasy VII.
Nice.
That's one of,
among
others that he would have worked on in that game.
A very unique section.
When you hear that, it's like, oh, of course.
Right.
But Motomo Toriyama went on after this game to direct Final Fantasy X-2.
Oh, that was him. That's right. That's right.
And to direct the Final Fantasy 13 trilogy.
Yeah.
And he is now, I believe, well, he was, I don't know what the technical credit would be for this, but like an assistant director on Final Fantasy VII Remake. He's credited
really?
under direction alongside like Tetsuya Nomura.
Yeah.
And now that Tetsuya Nomura is not directing Part 2, I think Motomo Toriyama is like kind of more in that position alongside. So Tetsuya Nomura, Naoki Hamaguchi, and Motomo Toriyama are credited as directors on the 7 Remake. I think Naoki Hamaguchi and Toriyama are the ones who will be leading
Continuing.
Part 2, as Tetsuya Nomura seems to be moving on to something else. Right?
Yeah.
So, anyways, that's who Motomo Toriyama is. Then you have Takayoshi Nagasato. He's going to be someone we'll be talking about a little bit because he did the maps for this game.
Yeah.
And traditionally, Final Fantasy games were kind of designed under the same design philosophy when it comes to field and map creation. You create, map screens that are within towns or caves or dungeons or things like that that you explore, but then you come out to a overworld map that connects all of those areas with little icons like castle icons or like archway icons that take you into a mountain or things like that.
Yeah.
And so you would walk onto that tile and it would take you into the map screens for the town or something like that. And then you come back out and you have a little character represented on this world that's sort of scaled in such a way to where he looks huge in the world.
And I think he wanted to do that. He wanted to have that similar thing, but 3D within the big world.
Yeah, so I've got a quote from him about his reason for wanting to actually get away
to not
from
do
that.
Okay, nice.
Which is a lot of Final Fantasy fans will notice, like this was a pretty big departure in the feel of exploration.
Yeah, because
from previous
you end up, it's
Final
just a
Fantasy
map
games.
with the ... just like a Mario game or something.
Yeah.
And you just kind of...
You just click on that city and you just kind of go there.
And you're just there, yeah.
Right. It's similar to, say, Final Fantasy Tactics world map, which is just nodes
totally.
that are connected,
Yep.
and you just go to a node, and anyway. Okay, so then you have Toshiro Tsuchida, who was the battle system director on this one. He went on to also direct the battle systems on the 13 trilogy, and he ended up becoming the head of Product Development Division 6. So before they had their current structure, which is creative business units, which are much smaller. I think there's only like 3 or 4 creative business units. I could be wrong on that. This has been years ago since they did this restructuring. They may have added some, but they had like a ton. They had a ton of what they called product development divisions. It was like 10 plus or something like that. And they consolidated those into just a select few creative business units. But during the time under that structure, Tsuchida, who did this battle system, was the head of Product Development Division 6, which produced My Life is King.
Oh, okay.
Which is actually a game I really, really like.
It's fun, yeah.
My Life is King is actually a really fun game. So I thought it was cool to learn that, that he had that sort of history at Square. For programmers, you have Koji Sugimoto, Takashi Katano, and then as artists, of course, Tetsuya Nomura, who did the character designs, Yusuke Naora, who did the art direction generally, and then Shintaro Takai. And then for writers of the story, Kazushige Nojima, who had written FF7 and 8, and now this. He's big. Most people who are big Square Enix fans know who he is, right? Daisuke Watanabe. And then Motomo Toriyama and Yoshinori Kitase are also credited as writers on this.
Oh, okay.
And then composers, Nobuo Uematsu.
Yes.
We all know him. But this I think was the first time where he didn't compose the entire game himself.
Yeah. He had like four people helping him. He had a lot.
So this was the first time he requested help from other composers to join him. And Masashi Hamauzu was one of the prominent composers featured on this soundtrack. I can really tell the difference in his style to Sakaguchi's style.
Well, Sakaguchi said, not Sakaguchi, Uematsu.
Uematsu
said specifically that he picked these people to help him out because their style was so different from his.
Right.
And so he wanted kind of their feel, and they work together, but they're different. And he wanted them because he could just do it himself if it was close enough. You know, he was looking for something different.
Nobuo Uematsu writes in like several different, he has this eclectic sort of like style where he jumps around in genres. Like he'll do the orchestral stuff, but he likes that like rock sound, and
He
then he'll
loves
do
the rock sound.
electronical stuff, and then
he's got some
dip
like
into
of the chants and the choir singing. You know,
he likes to play around in genre a lot.
Yeah, he does.
And he has a really heavy focus on strong melody. You can kind of you feel a Nobuo Uematsu soundtrack. You kind of know what it's like. Okay, so I'm here in post editing this right now, and I figured it might be interesting to do a little bit of a demonstration of the differences in style between Uematsu and Hamauzu. So I've pulled up some tracks here on YouTube, and I'm going to play some of the character themes, which are primarily done by Uematsu. I think all the character themes in FF10 are done by Uematsu. And for those of you who are familiar with Final Fantasy music, these will sound familiar, right? He has a style to how he writes his music that is pretty recognizable. So here's Yuna's theme, for example. Right? We got Titus's theme here. And then Riku's theme. This is another really good example of his style. He tends to write very clean, crisp, almost percussive, plucky sort of themes that have very strong, recognizable melody to them, right? And this is to say nothing of battle music. I'm kind of speaking specifically about one sort of type that each composer does. We could break down battle music and other types as well, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to stick to this. Now, let's skip over to Hamauzu. His style is much broader in the way that it feels. There's like wide soundscapes, lots of texture, which is sort of built with like a pad that's underneath everything. This just ethereal, mystical sort of pad that sort of just fills the soundscape, and he layers on top of that lots of interesting things. And it's not like he doesn't use melody, but melody doesn't seem to be at the forefront of a lot of the music that he writes. It's more atmospheric in nature. Here is Thunder Plains from Final Fantasy X. Right, do you see the difference between those two things? Here we have Macalania Woods from Final Fantasy X. A lot of times he'll use like a single element that's sort of just like pulsing the same note, or maybe just like a rhythmic sort of like little, I'm not sure I have the right like terminology for it. Maybe like a little phrasing, just like a short phrasing that will be usually kind of on the brighter end, like a bright piano. He likes to use really bright, sprightly piano for this sort of thing, that's driving like a beat with like a repeating rhythm or phrase with that instrument that he then behind that fills with these big pads and wide strings. Here's a really good one that I think really encapsulates Hamauzu's style, the Splendid Performance from Final Fantasy X. You see what he's doing at the piano there? Dun 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 dun. It's just repeating sort of like a phrase, and then he comes in and fills in the rest of the soundscape with these big sweeping pads and orchestral strings. Besaid Islands is another one that Hamauzu wrote. You hear that little electronic that's underneath all that, right? Now, you'll be able to recognize this a lot on the Final Fantasy XIII soundtrack. For instance, in this track, The Vestige. Or from this track, Mysteries Abound. Or from this track, Dust to Dust. Or from this track, The Cradle Will Fall. So I think you get the idea, and you can hear this across all of his soundtracks, even here in the Alliance Alive, right? Like the main theme from the Alliance Alive. Like, as soon as you start to hear that style, you'll really recognize it anywhere. This track here, The Rainy City Svarna, really has that feel to it. I mean, it sounds like something that could come straight from Final Fantasy XIII. This one, Rainy World, is probably the best example of the similarities. So anyways, hopefully that gives you an idea of what we're talking about when we're discussing the differences between Uematsu's style and Hamauzu's style. And hopefully you'll be able to pick that up as you play different games from these composers. World of Final Fantasy is another example where Hamauzu was the main composer. And it's got a lot of this sort of feel to it as well. Masashi Hamauzu is more... He has like big, wide soundscapes where he'll fill the space in with like a large pad or something like that. And it gives a lot of texture in the background of the piece, and then he'll kind of like layer in all of these things, and they've got this big, ethereal, sort of like textured, atmospheric almost sound to them. So he was the lead composer on Final Fantasy XIII, and that game very much has that feel to it.
Yes.
Other games that he's composed for where you'll hear this are The Alliance Alive.
Oh, Alliance Alive.
I don't know if you've played that.
I have not played it, no.
It was a Nintendo 3DS RPG, came out from Atlas a couple years ago. And it's pretty good, actually. I actually really like the game. But hearing the music in that game, it was like, oh, this is a Hamauzu soundtrack, isn't it? And you go check it. Like,
it was, nice.
So, he also did World of Final Fantasy, which has that feel to it as well.
I forgot about that game.
Hamauzu, I like his style a lot, but it is very distinct from Uematsu. And then the third composer, Junya Nakano, who actually did a ton of tracks on this as well. In fact, I think he might have done more than Hamauzu did.
Well, dude, this is a huge, what is there, 91 tracks?
There's a ton
91
of tracks on
this is a big
soundtrack. So those are the main players, and kind of like hopefully point you a little bit into some of the other work that they've done to familiarize yourself with that. Okay, so here's a quote here.
Okay.
Well, go ahead.
I was thinking, can we talk about 17, or should we?
Oh, 17?
Go
ahead. Actually, yeah, start there. That's a good place to start.
I've got it. So back when FF9 was, still being made, this game was not supposed to be a Final Fantasy necessarily. The game that was being developed, at least from Yoshinori Kitase, was it was going to be called 17, and it was going to explore like really interesting themes of life. Basically, somebody comes to the end of their life at the age of 17, and what would a world be like, with that? And you can see some artwork from it. It's got like little cherub angels and stuff, and it's fascinating. But the game that was going to be called 17 is what turned into Final Fantasy X.
Right.
Right? And so there's a girl named Yuna, and she was supposed to go on a pilgrimage for a humanitarian organization, a very different kind of thing. Yevon was going to be a humanitarian group instead of a church. And they were fighting a plague. There was a big plague that was going around, and she was one of the health workers who was going to go help people out. Anyways, that was kind of like the whole idea. Very similar themes were going to play into it, though. And Titus was supposed to be a plumber, is what I have written down. So before it was at the pod racing was the inspiration for Blitzball, which is weird.
Yeah.
It's weird. That's what it says. That's what he said. I don't know. I don't get exactly why, but for whatever reason, I think it's Kitase watches Star Wars and says, "Oh my gosh, I need to make Blitzball." I don't get the connection. I really don't. But it's fast. It's exciting. It's different. It's new.
It's actually a little bit similar to Hiroyuki Ito because he said that it was Formula One racing, but then also the NFL were his inspirations.
Hey, that's interesting.
For particularly FF12's
I
combat
see
system,
that.
but the Formula One racing for the ATB system.
That's fascinating.
Where it's like, anyways. So the things that
some
they
go faster than
watch
others,
that then translate into what they end up doing, it's kind of like hard to make the connection.
That's how
exactly
creatives are, though, And it's like they'll see something and it'll spark a fire in them that seems unrelated. To them, it's perfectly related. But they sure couldn't explain it to you. That's why they're artists. Otherwise, they can't. That's how they convey it. But anyways, it was going to be a very, very vastly different game, but similar themes. And they ended up scrapping everything but keeping the two main characters and then rebuilding FF10 kind of around them. Yeah. Some of the only similarities, well, there's some similarities we'll get into later because they're kind of spoilery about the story.
Right.
But one of them is that Titus and Yuna are both 17 years old.
Right.
That's one of the
few things
they carried over,
Yeah.
But it's pretty crazy. This game is totally going to be completely different.
Yeah, absolutely. But once they kind of got more in line, right, with the direction they wanted to go on this, real quick, I had this quote from Shinji Hashimoto, who is a producer.
Kingdom Hearts guy now, yeah.
Producer on Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts. Yeah. But he kind of talking about what I was saying earlier, right, with all the projects being done at the same time. The trio of PlayStation games we made provided a high boost to the company, so they sold really well, right? They enriched our lives. We moved to better offices in Meguro. We got new computers. Lots more staff were joining, but Sakaguchi was always looking for the next big thing. There were so many projects on the go at that time. I think at one point FF9, 10, 11, 12, and Spirits Within were all concurrently in development at the studio. So they were busy. FF7 changed their lives, for sure.
They kind of got it in over their heads a little bit.
Yeah, and so...
But...
yeah, some of the feedback that Kitase had received, because FF7 and 8, right on the back of each other, had very different, more futuristic or maybe sci-fi elements to them than
like a cyber
Final Fantasy fans were typically used to. I mean, 6 was a little more steampunk and kind of industrial almost.
Yeah, more industrial.
But like Industrial Revolution sort of age, right? But some of the fans were sending in complaints and being like, we want a fantasy world. Go back to doing a fantasy game, right? Again, it's hard to know exactly how many fans were when 7 and 8 were as popular as they were. And many people's first introduction to them.
It's this is clearly what people want.
Yeah, right? It's probably the majority were fine with it.
And then FF9 doing half as well as 8 is you would think that you'd have a pretty good idea based on the money dollars.
Yeah,
where things should go.
What people were enjoying in any way.
Yeah, what they wanted.
But anyways, when you're receiving negative feedback or complaints, it tends to feel like, oh man, I'm getting all these complaints.
Yeah.
And so, anyways, that's how Kitase was feeling, with people calling for a return to a more traditional fantasy setting for future Final Fantasy games. And rather than sort of like giving into that demand or like that request from fans, he had the idea that he wanted to sort of redefine or recontextualize what a fantasy setting could be. Because he felt like these fans' views were sort of constrained to this
the medieval
European medieval
Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah, European medieval. Yeah.
Specifically, like Western European medieval setting. Like that's what a fantasy setting is.
Yes.
And this is actually a sentiment I've seen from a lot of people online nowadays. Like, why does it always have to be medieval Western European stuff? Like, can we have like more interesting or different types of worlds other than that? We've seen that so many times, right? That's kind of the way he viewed this, right? That they had like a simple view on what a fantasy world could be. And so he wanted to really do something different that hadn't been done before. And this is, in my opinion, probably one of the most unique aspects of Final Fantasy X, and one of the reasons why I find it to be really special.
The setting.
The setting is so different from anything else.
Xanarkand and Spira.
Yeah.
And this is what one of the big takeaways for me, having not played this game in a while, playing it the second time and really appreciating how unique this is.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
In Xanarkand, there are rivers flowing through the sky.
Yeah.
Through the air, a river. Like, I've never seen that before nor since. It's been 20 years. No one's ever done that again.
Right.
At least I'm sure somebody knows of something, but it's like, that's such a cool idea.
Yeah.
And who would have thought of that? You know?
Tetsuya Nomura has actually commented directly on this too, saying he feels like this is what makes 10 stand out or be special in the series.
So far, that's my thinking as well.
Yeah, and it's
so cool.
So they decided to go to Asian influences rather than European ones to create their world.
Like Pacific.
The South Pacific islands was like where I think they actually went scuba diving there or went and visited. There's at least one member of the team I remember reading would go scuba diving there every year on his vacation. And so they were like, let's go down there and take elements from that culture and incorporate that into the world that we want to create here for this fantasy setting.
They took some Philippines, some Indonesia, some Thailand, some Okinawa, some Hawaii, and just like put it all together, but using Japan to kind of fill in the gaps. But so it's still fantasy, but it still seems very Western. But it's super Eastern. Even in the philosophy and some of the religious stuff, it's very Eastern. It's not very Western.
Right. And Okinawa in particular, right? There's been some, I can't remember. It's been a long time since I've like really like dug hardcore into the research on this particular thing. So I'm just trying to pull this from memory. But with the names, Titus and Yuna, right?
Oh yes, Tita.
Tita,
which
is the Japanese version.
Yuna. By the way, Yuna, not just Yuna. Now you say it however you want in English, but when you're referencing the Japanese, it's Yuna with two U's, because Yuna with one U means something different. You can look it up, people.
But Okinawa in Japanese is real different from.
It is. It's quite different. Yeah.
Island or main.
They would probably tell you it's not Japanese, but to the extent that it is Japanese, because the imperialistic, influence on their society, it is quite different Japanese.
Yeah. So those names, Tita, Yuna, mean sun and moon in Okinawan.
Yes.
So that could have been.
I can offer a little bit to this one. So Yuna sort of means moon. Tita definitely means sun.
Yeah.
Tita means sun for sure. Yuna actually is the Okinawan word for the hibiscus plant.
Okay.
Or what's the tree of the hibiscus, and then the flowers that bloom. And the hibiscus flower only blooms at night. And it symbolizes it's a symbol of the night. And the word yu, just in general, does mean night in Japanese. The yu, like there's a kanji to it. Anyways, it's the ta katakana, but in a kanji, it means yu and it means night. And that is sort of connected to the moon. So you've got Tira, who's the sun, and then Yuna is more night.
The daytime versus the nighttime, sun versus night.
And I think they could have, I think there's a way that they could have had Yuna's name mean moon, but they would have had to have changed one syllable to like maybe Utah or something like that. And they like the name Yuna better. And it still had that symbolism of night.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's the sun and then the night. So that's what those mean right there.
Yeah. So, people would bring this up in debates about how Titus's name is meant to be pronounced. See, it's a Japanese word, Tita, and I don't think...
In the Japanese, they say Tita, yeah.
I'm not sure, but James Arnold Taylor, who does the voice of
Well, they don't
Titus,
say his name in the game.
They don't, because you can put your own name in.
Yes,
right.
yes.
This is, I think, the last Final Fantasy game mainline
Where they
aside
allowed
from
you
the
to do
MMOs. Aside from the MMOs,
Yeah.
that allowed you to do this.
There may have been a philosophical reason for that too, not having his name there.
Well, yeah. Now that they're doing voice acting, it's like
I know it's hard.
now
it's
you
hard
can't
to
voice your character.
Yeah, I
in the
remember
game.
when we would play like NBA 2K12 or whatever, and it's like we'd name our characters, and it's cool. Like if your name happens to be a last name that they have in their little
already
database,
recorded.
then they'll say it.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't ever say my name. They'd always say your name because
Yep.
your name's Brown. That was annoying.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So there's a constraint there that they decided to
yeah,
do
big
away
constraint.
with after that.
Yeah.
So that because they always design very unique, like established characters as the main characters in these games.
Yeah.
It's not
But they
so
always
much.
let you rename. In this game, you can only rename yourself. You
Yes.
can't name
No.
the people around you.
Right.
And I think you can name your summons too, but that's like it.
Yeah.
That
Right.
you can't name other people. So
And so that sort of tradition ended after
it
this
ends,
game.
yeah.
And you can understand the reasons why. But that being said, his name is not said in the game for that reason.
Yeah.
And so people debate how the name's supposed to be pronounced. So James Arnold Taylor, who does the voice of Tidus in English, he says the name is Tidus. But the funny thing about it is the reason for it is not like, oh, this is what they told me it is.
Yeah.
They hired a narrator to do one of the trailers or commercials for Final Fantasy X in English who pronounced it that
said the
way.
name.
And nobody corrected him. Not because, oh, it should have been pronounced Titus, but wasn't, but because they didn't have any strong opinion on it.
Right.
And so they were like, okay, the American guy we hired to do this said
and
Titus.
that's
I
where
guess
your
that's
canon
right.
comes from.
That's where it comes from.
Yeah, that's so
That's
funny.
literally where it comes from.
Wow.
It's just, that's how it was said in that commercial.
Just because the Japanese name is Tida does not mean that the spelling Tidas or Titus.
It's
how's it
US.
spelled?
Tidus.
Tidus doesn't mean that the English is pronounced Tidus. Now
Yeah.
that's fine if you want to say it that way,
Yeah.
and it's a little closer to the Japanese, but the name is quite different in the Japanese. So I wouldn't say
Right.
that because they say it there that it has to be said a different way in the English.
Right.
But Titus is a more, if you're going to naturalize and localize the language
Yeah.
into a different culture, you will likely want to say it the way that they would say something like that.
I don't know the etymology of the name Titus, but would that not have something to do with water, like tide?
Tidal, tide,
Yeah.
I would think so. The
So
moon,
like
maybe,
that would
the
make
water.
sense with the game's water theme.
It
right?
would. Yeah, you'd miss the sun symbolism thing.
Right.
But you'd get a different symbolism, which may not actually fit. It may not actually fit. It might fit. It fits
might.
the environment for sure.
Yeah.
But it may not fit the sun-night
Yes.
dichotomy thing
Right.
they have going, the yin-yang kind of thing.
So anyways, it's funny because the guy who voices him in English, he insists
Yeah.
on Titus. He says you can pronounce however you want, but he likes that name better. That's the way that internally they pronounce the name and whatnot.
And that's fine. I mean, whatever. Most people
I-
probably said Titus growing up, though. When
Yes,
you're a teenager
I did.
and you get the game,
I certainly
yeah.
did.
Well, why not? That's how the name would be said in English.
Yeah. So I may slip in and out of pronunciations on this. I prefer Titus, but I say Titus because that feels more official in terms of like how it's meant to be, but I don't think they really care that much.
I don't know what I'll say. We'll see what I say.
So anyways, I'll let you guys debate in the comments like what you like better or whatever. So yeah, the team really began to resonate with this concept of a more Asian Pacific Island
Yeah.
influence for the clothing and the cultures and the religion and like the water theme,
Yes,
and the islands,
the
and
islands.
all of that as just to be their basis for how to create this world.
Yeah.
You can see that
Even some of the clothing, too. I took some notes on that.
Yeah. Well, if you have notes on that, go ahead and.
It's a little bit later, but it's about Yuna's
Okay.
dress in particular, so I'll bring
right.
it up later.
So you can definitely see this most particularly in early game areas like Besaid and Kilika, which very much have that sort of motif to them, right? That Pacific Island look and feel to them.
Yeah.
So this is another quote from Motomo Toriyama on this. He says, essentially, the previous games were done with an ethos of trying to depict European culture and settings in a fantastical way, but the setting for Final Fantasy X had a very Asian flavor. That was much closer to our own culture. The clothing of the characters also featured many traditional Japanese-style designs, which I think led to a unique world. So you have this Japanese influence mixed with South Pacific influences that sort of like cultivated into this unique fantasy setting that, I mean, maybe I just haven't played enough games since or before then, but
Yeah.
I haven't seen since or before. Like,
Well,
it feels very unique to this game.
I know. I would add The Legend of Zelda to that, to say that the way they merge East and West with, like, Breath of the Wild in particular, with Kakariko Village and stuff, is like pretty cool. It's
Yeah.
pretty interesting. It's like a clash of cultures, but
Yeah. So there was some concern. I think this is true anytime you're moving into a new console generation. It's like you have new hardware you're working with. Your entire workflow has to change. You just got it down. You just got to where
I know.
over the past 5 years you had this like really nice
you get your pre-rendered background
formula.
and,
Like we know how to work on this.
And it only lasted a few years.
And then it's like you got to switch it all up again. And that was true from 6 going into 7. It was like they had kind of locked in their
like
style.
3D,
It's like, how do we do this, right?
Yeah.
Then they got it figured out on 8 and 9, like how they were going to develop on the PlayStation 1.
And as soon as they perfected it,
then it's like PS2 is coming
Throw
out.
it
Okay,
away.
now how do we handle this, right?
Yeah.
So Sakaguchi has a statement on this. He says, going from Final Fantasy 6 to 7, everyone was uneasy about the transition. In making the jump to 3D, I had to ask myself whether this was indeed a Final Fantasy world as we progressed. This time, moving to the PS2, adding in voices and conducting everything in real time brought its own share of anxiety. But as I mentioned before, for me, the true definition of Final Fantasy is to continue challenging myself. So I'd like to explore new frontiers and move in a direction yet to be uncovered. So this was a big thing. We talked about this a little bit on our last podcast series with Vagrant Story. Square had a little bit of experience at this point with developing games fully in 3D, meaning environments and characters and everything in real time in 3D, rendering everything. Because with the Final Fantasy series, and even with Chrono Cross and Xenogears was the opposite, but they had 3D characters with a flat, pre-rendered still image in the background.
That's how they preferred to do it.
Yeah, and that just made it easier for them because it's like, you know, with something like Metal Gear Solid or maybe even The Legend of Zelda, right, which is still really big. It's a big world or whatever, but like these games are not nearly as large in scope as a Final Fantasy game was.
Yeah.
So the way that
true.
they handled that in terms of how many assets we have to create, how can we like consolidate this into a workflow that makes sense to release a game on a biannual sort of like cycle, right?
Yeah.
How do we do that? Their answer to that on the PlayStation 1, because they were always struggling with memory and with limitations on that console hardware, was flat image, just put a JPEG in the background and have them run around on it. Right? And like that's how we'll handle that so that we can like, you know, give ourselves enough runway to be able to make a game at the scope we want to, right? With Vagrant Story in particular, they were like, we're going full 3D on this.
Yeah.
And it made them have to cut a lot of stuff from Vagrant Story.
Yeah, it was hard to actually make a full game out of that.
They had a really hard limit on polygons and all these things. And so now the PlayStation 2 was like just an unbelievable leap in terms of like what it allowed them to do. So it was massive, and it meant that they were going to be making a Final Fantasy game fully in 3D for the first time. And so they're trying to determine how to tackle that. And I kind of like the way they did it, because part of the style, and we talked about this in our FF8 podcast, we really loved pre-rendered backgrounds because it created these like, not static camera angles, but like fixed camera angles that allowed the creators to frame exactly the composition they wanted you to see, right?
And it's almost like painting. Like you can get it, you can darken and brighten, and you can do things specific to that perspective that would not be able to be done were people allowed to have a free camera or anything like
there's
that.
a level of artistic control that the artists and director get with that,
they maintain
where
it,
they tell you what to look like or what to look at. Whereas with a free camera, the player's like looking over here while the guy's talking. And
Which 10 doesn't really have a free camera.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
That wasn't until FF11 and 12 that you started to have that.
I just now realized that, actually. That's interesting.
I like the way they handle it in 10, which is sometimes they'll have sort of that angle, fixed angle that looks like something from the PS1 era. So there'll be some places in FF10 where they do have
they could still
a pre-rendered background.
Nice.
And they look especially good because they've been repainted or retouched in the HD version. I remember
nice.
like really early on in Xanarkand, like right after Sin attacks, and Titus sort of like wakes up and he's like looking around. They just have this really, really beautiful, still, pre-rendered sort of background that he's on, and it's just like this feels like that PS1 era sort of style.
Oh, nice.
But at the same time, they have other shots where the camera's following you through the scene. So the camera's sort of gliding behind you, but then it'll like break off and sort of like come up here and highlight something. There's like especially a bridge later in the game where it's following Titus from like behind him on the right, and as he goes across the bridge, it swings behind him and it looks up at this huge temple structure. So like they have these really cool ways of highlighting what they want you to see in the environment, and then so you don't have control of the camera as a player, but they still built the whole map or the whole like field in 3D so that they could move a camera through it like that. But it feels like it's a continuation or an evolution of the style of the PS1 games.
Yes, I agree.
They wanted to have control over what you're looking at on the fields so that they could highlight the things they want you to look at. But now they have a 3D camera that they can do that. So I really like that aspect of it a lot.
Me too. That's a good middle ground between the pre-rendered versus the free cam 3D.
Yeah, and so obviously in the games that followed after that, it became commonplace and
that's
almost
what people
expected.
wanted.
You got to be able to control your camera. The player wants control over that, and so that changed afterwards. But I really like
especially a game like Final Fantasy 15.
Yeah,
you need the camera to be able to move in order to have fast-paced combat the way that they do it. You kind of need control over that camera.
Yeah, but there were other new techniques too, like facial animation. That were difficult. Were really difficult. So. Koji Sugimoto, one of the main programmers we mentioned for the game, he spoke about this and said, "We gave the designers a little more freedom with facial expressions, so they were able to include many bones in the faces. By doing this, we were able to create much more natural expressions. It's been said that the PS2 is a very complicated piece of hardware and that development is complex. That's indeed true, and it's taken a long time to master it, but the harder you try to push the hardware, the more rewarding the results. This is where the machine shows its true potential, and it's fascinating." And this was, for me, I mean, we had N64s and then GameCubes afterwards, but that jump from that console era to this one, this was one of the most shocking things to see, was facial animation in games like this. It was like, holy
blinking
crap.
And talking,
and like, just like muscles in the faces and the cheeks and jaws and the brows, that would move, not just like we were talking about before, where they flash a different texture on the face.
Yeah, they just swap the
where
textures.
they actually have like built sort of like muscle structures and bones in the faces that would animate. It was amazing. Also the jump in frame rate to like a 60 FPS. I remember watching, I think Parker was playing Tony Hawk 3 on the GameCube or something. I was just like, this looks real.
Yes.
The motion, the animation of it was so smooth. I couldn't believe it, and this was a similarly shocking thing to me. The first time I saw Final Fantasy X, I didn't have a PlayStation 2 at the time. A friend from school had one, and I would go to his house to play this game with him, and I was just absolutely like shell-shocked at how amazing it looked, animation-wise, and just like the number of polygons, the smoothness in the character models and the textures and things like that. It was completely mind-blowing, this leap. It was insane.
One of the things they were trying to do, Squaresoft at this time specifically, was to reproduce what they had done for Final Fantasy VII, where as the PS1 evolved and came onto the scene, they put Final Fantasy VII out, and it was this big, shocking, wow, this is what video games can do now. With Final Fantasy X, because this was released at the beginning of the PS2, not right at the beginning, but close, within the year, I think, and they wanted that similar kind of thing, like we're going to show people like what video games can be, again. And it's crazy that they were able to pull that off twice.
Right.
Yeah, and they did it again. I don't think they could quite do it a third time, but they did do it twice for sure.
Yeah.
But with back-to-back consoles, where it's like they were the flagship game, the one that everyone said, "Oh, you've got to have Final Fantasy VII / Final Fantasy X. You've got to have it."
Yep.
And I think it's amazing that they were able to actually do that, but that came through just the raw creativity of like, let's like really push this hardware as hard as we can.
I really think they did try to do that. And from a visual standpoint, in many ways, I think that they pretty much achieved it with Final Fantasy 13 on the PlayStation 3.
That one came out a little bit later though, right?
It was 2010, and I think the PlayStation 3 came out.
08?
Yeah, so it was a couple years after. Maybe 2007 or something, but
they were
actually maybe 6. It might have been 2006. Anyways.
Oh, it was 6. It was 6. So it was like 4 years later.
Several years later.
FF13 looks phenomenal.
But it looks really good.
It looks incredible. It just wasn't the flagship.
It wasn't that
this is what
game that you
do.
have to have on the PlayStation 3. It never achieved that status.
Yeah, not quite.
But I think they were still in the same mindset. Making that game, because that game went through quite a bit of a development hell, which is why it took so long to get it out. But that kind of, for better or worse, it seemed to be that was starting to become sort of like the expectation of a mainline Final Fantasy game. It was going to define visually what could be done. On a new console generation.
And it almost seems like Sony was banking on that. Because their partnership with Sony was such that Sony, when this game, so FF10 got delayed, a lot of people don't know this.
Yes.
It didn't meet its original release date.
Right.
It was the first Final Fantasy to be publicly delayed, which is like, was a big deal at the time. And it got pushed back to a specific date selected by Sony, not Square. The week that the GameCube was supposed to come out. And they were like,
funny.
We're going to put this game right next to the GameCube, which doesn't have a Final Fantasy, and people are going to say, whoa, the PS2 looks way better.
Yeah.
And that was genius, but that was Sony's decision. That was not Square's
do you know what's
decision.
so interesting about that? Is that decision to delay it to the date that it was what pushed Square into the red ink for the first time in the company's history.
They missed.
Because their sales projections were totally off for that, like, sort of like, what do you call that?
Fiscal year.
Fiscal year.
Yeah.
And that put all kinds of pressure on them to make structural changes in the upper management. So this is where Sakaguchi and the president of the company at the time, who basically totally supported Sakaguchi's vision on how Final Fantasy should be made. So you had your CEO or your president. Hisashi Suzuki was the president of Square Enix at the time. The executive vice president was Hironobu Sakaguchi. And then you had the COO, Yoichi Wada.
Oh, Wada.
Right?
Yes.
And Yoichi Wada was philosophically opposed to Sakaguchi's philosophy for how they should be running the business in how they develop
Wada
games.
wanted more sequels. Right?
Yes, because in his mind, as a businessman, we've already created these assets. Asset creation costs this much money and takes this much time. Make a sequel so that you reuse the assets. Sequels, because you can produce them cheaper and you can bank on a franchise, a popular game or something like that, and sell many, many more games that cost a fraction to make. Sakaguchi's philosophy from the beginning of his time at Square was never to make direct sequels to things because that's creatively bankrupt. We want to make a new thing every time that's shocking and creates like a brand new world. And that was sort of his whole idea behind Final Fantasy was this you go into it as if you'll never make a sequel to it. It's like the final thing you will ever make.
Oh, sure, yes. Right? Yeah, I like that.
It's like, this is our only chance. We're not going to save anything for a sequel because there will be no sequel. This is the last. Treat this as if it's the last game you'll ever make.
And I respect that a lot, right? Because I hate sequels. I hate season 2. It's like if you got good ideas, put them in your original story. Don't save them for something else.
Right.
Yeah.
So really quickly, I kind of just want to qualify that last statement that I made there, right? Because there's a lot of different quotes out there about where the name Final Fantasy came from. A couple of different ones from Sakaguchi himself. So he's given talks, I think one was in 2011 and another in 2015, about the name Final Fantasy really just coming from the fact that they wanted a name that could be abbreviated to FF in English, the alliteration of which is pleasant to the ears of Japanese people. So originally they were going to go with Fighting Fantasy, but because there was a conflict with copyright with a game book series of the same name in Japan, they settled on Final Fantasy. All of that is true, but he has also been quoted in other interviews, I think in this one in particular in 2007, as saying, the name Final Fantasy was a display of my feeling that if this didn't sell well, I was going to quit the games industry and go back to university. I'd have to repeat a year, so I wouldn't have had any friends. It was really a final situation. And then, in addition to this, here toward the end, he said, way back then, the spirit was that we weren't making a product, but a creation. It was putting our soul into the production, pouring all of your ideas into the game, even if they crop up during development, not saving anything for the sequel. So a combination of these things are sort of at the center of what the spirit of Final Fantasy was, but certainly one part of that was this idea that you're going to treat this like it's the final game you'll ever make, and you're not going to save ideas for a sequel, you're going to put it all into this. So that's where I'm coming from when I'm making this point about the conflict of philosophy between Yuichi Wada, who wanted to make tons and tons of direct sequels, and Sakaguchi, who was very against that from the beginning.
So they butted heads about this. Now, this decision, and it's interesting you say Sony made this decision to push FF10 into the next fiscal year.
I want to say that Square Enix maybe had to push it back, but Sony picked where it would be pushed back to.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the fact that it got pushed out of that fiscal year, because a lot of people blame Spirits Within for being the reason why they were in this horrible financial situation.
Yeah.
And it's not exclusively that. It's part of it, but it's not exclusively that.
Yeah.
They lost a lot of money on that. But had Final Fantasy X come out in the fiscal year it was meant to come out in, they would not have ever hit red ink. They would have been fine. Because Final Fantasy X did so well.
Like crazy well,
That Square was back on their feet like this.
Yeah.
And then Kingdom Hearts on the back of that, which
Kingdom Hearts did
Sakaguchi
well.
was an executive producer on it and put Tetsuya Nomura on.
Nomura.
They would have been fine.
He was still making good decisions, you're saying, as the executive
So
vice
this
president.
one failure did not create this disaster. All it did was push it into a fiscal year where Yoichi Wada could take advantage of the situation. And so now the investors come to, oh my gosh, we've lost all this money in this fiscal year. Let's make all these changes. Yoichi Wada becomes president. His philosophy becomes what dominates Square Enix's philosophy thereafter into the next two
Final
console
Fantasy
generations. Final Fantasy X got made right after that. A
started
billion
making
Kingdom Hearts sequels.
Yes.
Final Fantasy 13 trilogy. It's basically
and they
all
were
they started
developing
doing.
a 12 sequel as well, but I think that got scrapped.
Well, they did have a DS, Tactics Final Fantasy 12
really?
game, Revenant Wings. I don't know if you've ever seen
Revenant
that.
Wings. No.
So anyways,
I never played it, but there was another one that was being developed.
It's not Spirits Within's fault that they were in a bad place. That's part of it, but the other part of it was FF10 being delayed into the next fiscal year, which wasn't really. It was just the way that the business world is run that made it look like that.
The money people
but
didn't
it was
like it.
Very, very quickly off the back of that scary red ink release or announcement. We have this game that's going to freaking fix everything. So
it made them hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
Hundreds of millions. Just in the first week, I think this game sold 2 million copies.
Yeah.
Which it would have accounted for well more than what they spent on this game. I think this game's budget was a little over $32 million back in 2000. So it'd be maybe double that now.
Right.
But what they made was $150 million that first year, and then they made even more past that because this game kept selling well beyond.
Yeah.
So you make a very good point. It's just it was almost like an accident that this had to happen, but the forces were at work underneath to take advantage should this happen anyways. It almost seemed like this was inevitable.
Yeah.
They were being pushed here and something was going to give them the excuse to kind of overturn everything and then merge with Enix and go forward in a new direction.
Right.
Something was going to make
But
that
it was
happen.
a fateful decision to push FF10
Sakaguchi.
back. It changed a lot of things because
I'm
of it.
sure. I'm sure.
Okay, so another thing I want to touch on is recognizing as you're playing this game the stylistic differences between this team's way of doing things and other Final Fantasy games, right?
Yeah.
And this is not to say, obviously I have a preference, but it's not to say one's better than the other. It's just to create the media literacy in our followers to be able to see differences in things and understand why they're done and things like that.
Good.
So we talked a little bit earlier about the maps being different, right?
Yeah.
This is something that you see in basically all of the games made by this team after this. So in Final Fantasy VIII, they still had the overworld map, and
Your
in
little
fact,
miniature representation.
I brought up an interview in the FF8 podcast that Yoshinori Kitase said it's not a Final Fantasy game without a world
Unless
map.
it has that.
Right?
Nice.
But then here is when
Yeah.
that really started to change for this team, where they started to design their worlds in such a way to where they're basically very long, linear, hallway-like map fields that have branching paths to a treasure, but mostly you're just walking down a line, a hallway to go from one end to the other.
Yeah.
We're going to talk a little bit more much later in the podcast about why this is a good or a bad thing.
Yeah, I was going to say that in and of itself doesn't mean that it's a bad
Yes.
story because the pathway is linear.
Yes.
It can affect gameplay and maybe your perception a little, but that doesn't mean that it's bad just because
Yes.
it's linear. Yeah.
Right. And there are many linear, very, very linear games that are some of my favorites of all time, like the Prince of Persia trilogy on this era's console era here. They're exceptionally linear. It's not linearity alone that makes something enjoyable or not.
Right.
And we'll go over the differences because this became a huge controversial thing on Final Fantasy 13, which had the
13 in
same
particular.
map director, same team of people,
Okay.
but people did not complain about it in this game. They complained about it in that game. So what's the difference? That's something to look forward
We'll
to
talk about.
later in the podcast. But another thing they took away was the airship and the overworld. And this to me is something that I've really, really missed. And I just desperately wish they would just go back to it.
Yeah.
I know that like open world is the thing now, or this sort of like in Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's very similar, very linear. It's kind of small hallway sort of like maps that lead into a little bit of a bigger open area to do a fight and then go back into the hallway again, connecting you to different fights.
Yeah.
I personally don't love that
Me neither.
way of approaching map and field design. But that's the way that this team really does it. In FF10, it doesn't bother me very much at all because they do a really good job of mixing up how you interact with the world.
I think so, yeah.
But I do still miss the feeling, which I thought was a very quintessential Final Fantasy thing, of the first time, even just the first time you get a vehicle, whether it's the buggy in Final Fantasy VII, you
Or
can drive around,
the
or
chocobo.
a chocobo,
Yeah.
or a ship to
Yeah.
go across the ocean. But in particular, the best moment almost of all those PS1 RPGs from that time was the airship.
Yes.
You get the airship, and now I can fly
can
anywhere.
go wherever you wanna
that
go.
sense of freedom, just like the
Yeah.
whole world just opened up to me.
Yep.
Where have I not been yet?
And
I
you'll
haven't been
spend
there, I
the
haven't
next
been there.
like 5 hours of the game
Yes.
is you just looking around and exploring for the hidden treasures in different places.
Exactly
and
right.
Going back to the beginning of the game to go visit.
Yes, and this game
Yeah.
does not have that. When you get the airship later on in the game, you basically just get a list of towns. Like we said, it's sort of represented with nodes on like a map,
Yeah.
like an unfurled map or something of Spira. And you have the nodes that are the different locations, and you just sort of choose from a list where to go, and you sort of warp there.
And you're just there.
Now, there's a little bit of nuance to this discussion, which I'll get into in just a second. But I wanted to put out this quote from Sakaguchi, because a lot of people may not know this either. The airship is essentially, it was pioneered by him in Final Fantasy I.
Oh, really?
The whole concept of
No
an
way.
airship in an RPG like this was a Final Fantasy I invention.
Sweet.
And the reason for it was because in Dragon Quest, or the original Dragon Warrior, which is Dragon Quest I in Japan, they had like a warp magic. So it's like you could use a spell that would sort of like let you go to different places and fast travel, right? But Sakaguchi had a different idea about how he wanted to approach this. He said, as for warp magic that would let you move between towns, it would definitely be convenient. But if players use it too much, they'll never get familiar with the terrain or map. With the Final
Genius
Fantasy
solution.
series, we want both the story and the terrain of the world to remain in players' memories. So our solution was to include the airship vehicle. Flying around like that feels great anyway, so players won't be bothered by the lack of a proper warp spell, I think. So it's a fast way to get where you want to go, but say you're traveling between that and you see something over here, well, what's that?
Yeah.
So you're not missing out on all of this content that you've created, secrets in the world that you would miss by just warping over here and not moving past it physically with an airship. And so like that was the whole design philosophy behind that choice. And so you miss that a little bit. It feels different. You don't get like this attachment to the geography of the world. The
the orientation, where things are in relation to each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
And landmarks and things like that you do when you're actually physically moving through the space. Now, here is the caveat to this, or the counterpoint that can, I think, reasonably be made to this. On the flip side of that, the airship's list of locations in this game does include like hidden options in it, right?
Oh, okay.
So discovering those requires the use of like a coordinate system.
Oh, yeah.
So like you kind of like you explore around with coordinates on the map to like see, oh, here's a hidden location. So there's still an element of that exists in this form.
Okay.
It's not like it's totally abandoned, but I still don't feel that it feels the same.
Okay, right.
Or has the same impact overall.
Yeah.
So that's one of the major changes that was made to the series hereafter, to Final Fantasy's design philosophy.
Yeah, because
that goes back to the beginning.
Yep.
Yeah, 12 is all zones.
I know.
They're large zones. They're not like these super linear hallways.
Yeah.
They're massive
bigger
zones, but they're still.
It's just a teleport.
It's basically you're warping around, right?
Yeah, and even with Final Fantasy 15, who technically in the Royal Edition lets you fly the car, in an open world game, it's just not the same. It's not the same at all.
Yeah. The other major difference in style between this team and former teams was, and we talked about this way more in the FF8 podcast, so again, I'll point you there, but they were really driving a more realistic aesthetic to things.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of fantasy based in reality, which was kind of the tagline for 15 a little bit, was started in 8, but it really started to take off here. So anyways, that's the other stylistic difference. So the way that they handle maps, and traversal and exploration, the way that they handled the visuals, they really focus on that. Like that's almost like number one.
I think so.
For a while, and I actually have a quote somewhere in here. I don't know where it is, but we've been going on for so long that I kind of want to get through the rest of this more quickly. But for a while, Square Enix was making games visuals first, gameplay second.
Yeah.
Like that was the way it was going. It was like they would create the art and the assets first, and then they would start thinking about the game that would go with that. Actually, I think it was the guy who did, I was just reading this hold on, I just had it right here. The guy who produced My Life as King, Toshiro Tsuchida. He was talking about how he was like rethinking the way that they approach games, because for a long time on Square they were doing art and assets first and gameplay second. And he was like, no, we got to do it the other way around, kind of a thing, right? Anyways, Square and of course Naoki Yoshida.
Oh, Yoshida.
Naoki Yoshida.
Okay.
He said something similar, right? Like the obsession with graphics in this company needs to change. That's what. So, anyways, this kind of became like an obsessive thing for them, was like making these amazing visuals, but that limited the scope of the game. Because it was like rendering this, optimizing it for the hardware, right? So that's why they kind of stuck to these linear hallway sort of map designs, so that you're not rendering as much, or so that you can hide load screens or things of that nature. Whereas Final Fantasy XII, while Final Fantasy XII in many ways on the surface looks better than Final Fantasy X, those models are actually lower poly. And there's like a lot of other things that they're doing to be able to have massive maps like that.
Oh, interesting.
It's mostly an art direction thing that gives it its look, not so much like the actual quality of those models.
Interesting.
And FF10's models are actually higher quality on the base PS2 than Final Fantasy XII's are.
Wow,
and that's because they designed their world the way they did, and so it was easier on
so they were able to
rendering
do that.
Yes. And that's why Final Fantasy XIII was designed in the way that was, why Final Fantasy VII Remake is designed in the way that it is. They're pushing for those high fidelity, realistic, fantasy based on reality visuals. So that's the other telltale sign of this team's style. Anyways, I think I've more or less made my point there, but I think we should also touch on voice acting a little bit. Since this was the first Final Fantasy game to have voice acting.
The first one,
How do you feel just generally about the voice acting in the game?
I don't like voice acting in most games.
Me too.
So I tend to be averse to it.
I take that back. I don't love it in Japanese role-playing games very often. I think it's fine in a lot of other genres.
That's funny.
But it's not even just like Japanese games. It's Japanese role-playing games. There's like a very particular style, and it's tied with anime.
Yes.
In the way that English dubs are done. for these games and these shows that I do not appreciate the style very much.
Yeah.
Typically, I would rather not have it than have it be the way it is.
That's how I feel.
I don't hate
Generally
it
speaking.
in this game, though.
I don't for the most part. I'm listening to the Japanese,
Okay.
and that's how I get around it.
Yeah.
I'm okay with listening to this game in Japanese.
Yeah.
I have not actually listened to much of this game in English.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I don't know. I tend to be of the opinion that things made in a certain language were geared towards that language and would sound better in that original language than whatever they're localized to.
Yeah.
So I've seen very little of what Final Fantasy X is in English.
Yeah. I think that most of the time it's fine. I'm not bothered by it really that much. And I remember being more bothered by it than I have been so far on this playthrough. I will bring up examples as we're going through the game in ways in which I feel like the direction could have been stronger, but I really feel like the problem with this team's English dubs is not always a writing issue. It's more a writing issue on 13. In this game, I don't think it's a writing issue so much as, or even an acting talent issue, as much as it is a direction issue.
Okay.
Because Final Fantasy 12 has excuse me, Final Fantasy 12 is phenomenal voice acting.
I think it's quite good. It's probably better. It's better than almost any game I've ever played.
Yes.
Is Final Fantasy 12.
Final Fantasy 12's writing and voice acting is phenomenal.
It's quite good.
The translation in that game was done by Alexander O. Smith, who also did Vagrant Story and who also did this game.
And who did this game? I was going to say
Alexander
he did this too.
O. Smith did this game. There's a really funny quote from him.
I may have written it down actually.
I'll let you do it then.
So Alexander O. Smith said that in writing such a constricting manner, given that the English couldn't overdo what the Japanese had done, right?
Yes.
So there was an issue with your audio track, right? So if your audio track is going to play something, it needs to be the exact length of the FMV. It couldn't be longer. That would cause the whole system to crash, right? And so he said trying to fit everything in for every cutscene into the allotted amount, it was like something akin to writing 4 or 5 movies worth of dialogue entirely in haiku form. And, of course, the actors had to act well within those restraints, right? So he's writing basically just a bunch of haikus because the English we're too verbose. We say too much in, it takes us too long to say what we need to say. So when the Japanese say their short thing in English, it's like, it doesn't fit. So you got to be poetic to try to make it work.
Right.
And it just doesn't sound natural when you do that.
Right. It's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And this is made more apparent because before, they could just write dialogue into a box. But now they have to try to match the character speaking because it's voice acted.
Yeah.
So it's
really
even
hard.
more difficult to fit the English into the same space as
and
the
what
Japanese.
you say, because this is funny, because with anime, it's not as big a deal if the voices don't match the mouth, because the mouths tend to not
just
do
flap
anything too
anyways.
crazy. Yeah, they're not too detailed. This game is incredibly detailed, and the 3D is really good, and they really took time making sure those lips matched the syllables of the Japanese
They
language.
tried to.
They did a pretty good
in
job.
Japanese they did.
That's what I'm saying.
In English they did.
But because they were so particular and detailed in the Japanese, that made it so impossible to do the English.
Right.
So they were trying to fit in whenever the Japanese would say the M sound and whatever, the mouth movements, they were trying to find English words that would fit well with the movement of the mouth, not just the context of the scene or the translation, right? So if there was another English word that's maybe less natural, but it fits the way the mouth was moving, and maybe it's a 5-syllable word and the mouth, you didn't want to use your 2-syllable word for it, you got to use the longer one, even though it's worse, but it fits it makes it seem like the guy's actually saying it, then you use that word. But that's hard for voice actors when you're doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of dubs will do that. It's funny because the reverse isn't necessarily true. In Japan and Korea and Europe and all over the world, they watch a lot of American movies in English, and they will not mind so much if the dub doesn't match perfectly, because most of the high quality content they watch tends to be a dub, and so it's not a big deal.
I think that traditionally was very true in, say, the 70s, 80s, 90s Hollywood movies were like...
Yes.
I think now the world's catching up to Hollywood
I think
a
so.
little
I
more.
think so.
Yeah.
I think so. But especially during this time in the 80s and 90s
Yeah.
and video games and at the beginning of this, something that Americans don't do is watch dubbed content. We tend to just watch American stuff, you know?
Yeah.
And so whenever we import things from that's why Americans would rather not read subtitles. They'd rather not see they are very picky that the dub has to match perfectly because it's difficult, you know? Anyways, I don't want to be too hard on Americans.
Yeah.
But in Japan, it's not as big a deal if the dub doesn't match. In America, it has to match because we don't want to feel like it's a dub. It needs to feel like it was normal because we aren't exposed to dubs as much. So that makes it really, really hard for the voice actors and stuff. Because I think, what's his name? Who voiced Tidus?
James Arnold Taylor.
James Arnold Taylor. He was watching the video as he was giving his performance.
Right.
So that's part of how you make sure the lips sync up. But it's a different language, right? Like, that's so strange. It should be a time constraint. But because he was watching the lip movements as well as the time constraint and everything that needed to be done, it affects your performance.
It does.
That's
sure.
the whole point.
Well, the other part
they
of
aren't speaking English. If you're trying to dub someone who spoke English, but you're dubbing their voice just to make it sound deeper or whatever, that's one thing. They're at least saying the same words as you. When you're watching the video and you're trying to speak as this person's speaking, and their mouth isn't doing what you're doing, or you're trying to make your mouth do what theirs is doing, but it's a different language, that can introduce so many problems.
It's going to affect the convincing, natural nature in which you're capable of delivering a line.
Yes.
It's inevitable. It's never going to feel as natural that way, under those constraints. So
absolutely.
when you consider all those things, it's like the talent here did a really good job with
I
what
think
they
they're
had.
good voice actors in general.
Now,
Yeah.
I really like
From
James
what I've heard.
Arnold Taylor. I think he's a phenomenal voice actor who has had a
really?
prolific career.
Nice.
He's particularly a great impressionist.
Oh, yeah.
So he does like Obi-Wan Kenobi's voice in the Clone Wars, and he
nice.
does Fred Flintstone in a bunch of cartoons. And
really?
so his range is amazing.
Oh, cool.
He can do all kinds of voices, and he's done a lot of like Michael J. Fox, who did the voice of Milo, I think, in Atlantis. He stepped in when Michael J. Fox couldn't record lines,
and he
did that character
I would never-
in shows
I haven't
and
seen
other
that movie
things.
in a while, but that's interesting.
So like he does like a perfect Michael J. Fox
Nice.
impression. So he's a dynamic, incredibly talented actor.
Yeah.
And I have my qualms with the voice of Tidus, just like many other fans do, that I will talk about later. But it has nothing to do with his talent.
Yeah,
Nothing.
I would probably, because I've seen very little, but what I've seen, I just tend not to blame everything on one element anyways. It's too easy to just blame the actor. It's like,
Yes.
no, there's the system, there's the writing, there's the direction. We don't know quite what the direction was like here.
Yeah.
Often for anime and for video games, at least 20 years ago, when somebody was, giving their voice talent, they would hear the original Japanese, and they would say, "Kay, do it the way he did it."
Yes.
And that's not how you localize. That's not a good idea.
Yes.
You don't want to deliver it the way they said it in Japanese.
Yes.
And the way they say certain things in Japanese, and specifically the tone of voice, the drama, the way that they are speaking more theatrically, it's not something that Americans want as much in what we consume.
I agree.
Especially as it relates to females with women voices, right?
Yeah.
In Japan, they're often very high-pitched with the anime video game type.
very cutesy.
In this game, they are a lot.
Inflection.
I think Riku's voice, she sounds like she's 10 in
Yeah.
the Japanese.
Yeah.
Really, really young.
Yeah.
Like really young.
Yeah.
Which is strange for her character. And then you can't just do that when you bring it over to America. You can't just have a 10-year-old sounding voice. You've got to actually localize it.
Yes.
But they tend to just say, "Oh, do what that voice actor did," and it's not.
Yes.
It's not good.
So this is another sort of telltale sign of the style of this team,
Yeah.
right? They sort of lean into that.
Yeah, the anime kind of
And
thing.
this is the writing and the voice direction side of things. Because the voice direction and writing on 12 is very, very different from 10.
It's not anime at all.
But 10 and 13, a lot of crossover, a
that's
lot of
true.
similarities
That's true.
in
That's
how they're voiced and how they're written.
Yeah.
I have a whole thing in my Final Fantasy 13 retrospective of the girl who does Vanille's voice being coached on how to do breath, like
Grunts
there's a very grunts, and it sounds very sexual, and it's very uncomfortable for her to like demonstrate it with the interviewer.
Biggest challenge was getting the sound right. There's a particular sound that Vanille makes that from the minute I walked in, they were like, "There's this sound you're going to need to learn," and I got it after the first session, but it was that was the biggest thing, creating the sounds of Vanille. I would say that 450 at least of my lines included vocal quality sounds that aren't necessarily natural.
May you give us a sample of one of these sounds?
Sure. Say they wanted a happy reaction, it would be and sad reaction is and then running would be so it's a little bit.
But she's like, they told me specifically, like there's a very specific way that you need to do this breathing and these grunts. And it's to match, it's to match the Japanese, right? And so like, what I'm saying is that this is another one of those things where it's just like, these Final Fantasy games have these things in common, right? So it's a trademark of their style, of the way that they do things. And there's even, we'll get into this probably in next episode when we talk about the opening scene. It just, there's something about the way they're introducing mysteries that just like immediately, this is very Kingdom Hearts to me. This feels very Kingdom Hearts to me, this the way that they're doing this. Yeah. There's a style that you can recognize.
Totally.
So,
very much so.
I just want to point that out, right? So that as you're playing through the game, you can kind of pick up on these things so you can know who it is that's behind the decisions being made here, so you can see what was their ambition, why did they make the choices they make, you know, what were they thinking when they did this. We haven't even touched on the battle system yet, but battle system goes back away from ATB, which had been the standard since 4, and takes it back to a true turn-based system, so that the game actually pauses when you're going through menus. It's not like the enemies are going to get their turn and keep attacking you, right?
Because you're slow, yeah.
Right. So they've kind of gone away from that, and all these other things that we've talked about, they've gone away from. And one of the big new challenges was voice acting. Yeah. And like, how are we going to do this? This is going to be expected from here on out in video games, right? There was a lot of things that went into the development of this game. I have one more quote here from Yoshinori Kitase. At the beginning, none of us really knew what to do. The real difficulty there was we had always had the option to keep fixing text up until the very last second of the final master versions, because there was no voices, right? So it's like, if we want to change the line, we could change it right in the 11th hour.
Yeah.
If there was something that was hard to understand, we could just put in a hint. But once voice acting was added in, you had to make sure that the voice actor had time in their schedule to go and record in the studio. Once you realized how much was involved, it became clear that the character lines needed to be firmed up as early as possible. This was very different from previous games, and I remember struggling to get everything finalized so early. So things were changing. And also these games have, just tens of thousands of lines of dialogue.
Yeah, it's somewhere around 10. I think it was 9,000. There's in the neighborhood of 9,000 lines of dialogue in Final Fantasy
It's insane.
It's
over 9,000!
Over 9,000. Yeah, it's incredible. It is just massive.
So, in any case, I was actually afraid that we might not have as much content to go over for the development history as we normally do, but we actually filled up a whole first episode with development history.
Well,
so, there you go.
In that case, I actually have a little more to add then, if we're just going to stay here.
Let's do that.
And one of them is about the leveling system, the progression system,
character
which was different.
The sphere grid.
Yeah. It's different from previous, where you just go up a level and you're just stronger now because you went up a level.
That's another thing that's common to this team's style, is the Crystarium, and even Final Fantasy VII Remake has this a little bit. There's this spherical, nodal sort of like progression.
Well, I love it because you're making these shapes and patterns that are just really significant and really cool, and these mandalas and all this stuff. But it changed from what it was originally supposed to be. So it was going to be taking on the Polynesian kind of nature of the theme, thematic material within the game. There were going to be tattoos that you were going to slowly create a really cool tattoo on your body that instead of creating this abstract kind of idea, you were actually going to be drawing, and then you were going to add different elements, and there was like a grid, a space where you could like it was supposed to represent like your back or your chest or something, and you were going to be able to customize your own tattoo and then put
my
different
goodness.
elements in, and each different tattoo would equate a power.
I wonder if this is what lingered on Jecht for the tattoo on his chest.
Ah, there's that.
I wonder if that
Seymour
part of the design
also has some tattoos.
was a lingering idea from that idea.
I wonder. I bet you it is. I'll bet you it is. Because it's his whole body,
Yeah, and
right?
even in the first scene, we'll get into this next time, but
Yeah.
when Titus looks off and he sees the burning symbol, like the Jecht symbol, he's like,
Yes.
oh, my old man.
And that's his team's logo, kind
Yeah.
of. Yeah.
I wonder if
It's his
that
necklace.
was left over to show how powerful someone is.
Ah, he had the completed-
expansion of a tattoo on the chest.
Interesting.
That's actually way cooler than
That's
what they
entirely
did.
possible. It's sweet. I don't know exactly why they dropped it, but maybe they couldn't do enough, or maybe the player would have had too much freedom to customize the tattoo, although I don't think that was the case. I'm pretty sure it would have been revealed going out, but I don't know. There's not a ton of info on how it was going to work, just that it was going to be a tattoo system in keeping with the some of the more Polynesian traditions of, tattooing as you get older. You get more tattoos. As you get stronger, as you do more things, you
super
get tattoos
cool.
about the thing.
That's
I think
so
it's sweet.
cool.
And in some ways,
How is
I'm
no
like,
one-
why
they
did
need-
they not do it?
Some
But-
other game needs to do this now.
Yes, some other game should do this. The idea's been out there for 20 years now.
Do it.
In fact, that system was shown when they first unveiled this game at the Square Expo event, something in 2000 or so. They showed that system, along with an online functionality that was going to be called playonline.com, something like that.
Wow.
And this Final Fantasy X was supposed to be an online game, at least in some aspects were going to be online. They couldn't get any of that to work, so they just totally scrapped the whole thing, including the tattoo system. But I wonder if it has something to do with the fact that you've got your main character, right? And you're going to have to, he'll take off his shirt, you won't see the tattoo otherwise, what's the point? And he's just going to be loaded with tattoos by the end of the game.
That'd be so cool,
It
though.
would be sweet. It would be sweet. But at the same time, certain cultures are averse to that kind of stuff.
maybe.
And American culture, say what you want, but in Japanese culture, you don't just
they
go
don't.
get tattooed. The
Tattoos
only
are-
people, okay,
it's kind
this-
of like what
it's
is it?
Yakuza.
Association.
Now, I think that's changing. Maybe the past decade or so. More, it's becoming a little more common. Like I noticed, is Korea, but it's similar culture-wise. Some of the members of BTS, one of them I think, got a tattoo on his arm. And it was like and that's like,
ooh.
he's a rebel. He's a real rebel in that culture.
Yeah.
And of course, that's all decided by their agents. Like, it's not like they actually have any
Sure.
say in that stuff. They don't really own themselves,
It's
because they're
all
idols,
branding.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about some of that later on, the idol nature of everything.
Yeah.
But in Japan, man, at least, especially in this time, the year 2000, 2001, 2002, like, the only people that have tattoos are former or current Yakuza members.
Crazy.
And maybe a few, emo punk people besides that. And that's it. Like, nobody else has tattoos in Japan. It's very, very uncommon. And so I wonder if that kind of played into it a little as well.
decision
Where
to
they're like, this
abandon
is a
that.
sweet idea, but dude, our dude's gonna look like a total gangster. And he's only like a 17-year-old kid. And like, I don't know if Japan's gonna like this, I can imagine that may have played a factor.
I could see that.
Such a good idea, though.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
That's literally so cool. And the fact that Jecht has that giant tattoo on his
Yeah.
chest makes me think that must have been a
I
remnant
would,
of that
I would
idea.
think so, yeah.
That's crazy.
And I would also say Seymour as well.
Seymour
he's got
too. Exactly.
some of that imagery.
Well, there you have it, people.
Oh,
Hopefully
but then
that
here's
was-
the other thing. Because every character levels up, right?
Yes.
So now Yuna's going to end up with
Oh,
a full
tattoos.
sleeve of tattoos.
That would be so sick, though. It would be so
I know.
unique.
I'm not saying it's bad.
It'd
I'm
be
just saying
awesome.
you're going to end up with a full cast where everyone is just tattooed up.
like Mike Tyson,
Like
fake
Mike Tyson.
face tattoos
just
and
all
stuff.
over, and it's just like, okay, it just kind of messes with some of their character design, It's like, what's going to happen here? And I think they were allowing some level of customization on the tattoos. So it's like, what was this going to end up looking like? What could possibly happen here? I mean, I don't know.
That's crazy. Well, hope you guys enjoyed that first episode. We were trying in the last podcast series we did
Yeah.
to break up development history over the course of the series rather
Yes.
than doing it front-loaded. But there were many of you who asked us to front-load it again, so we did this
So we did.
for you. We hope that
Yes.
you enjoyed it.
We will still maybe have little anecdotes. I know I have a few later on.
Oh, sure.
Of different quotes and things from the developers as
Sure.
we go. But for the most part, that is the history of the development of this game.
Yeah. So we will jump into the where you should play up to for this next episode is up through
Well,
when you arrive at the Kilika Temple.
Yes.
get at least up to there. We might not make it that far.
I don't think
but we're
don't
going
think
to
we will.
try. And
this
see
may
if we
be a
can get there.
longer podcast like Xenogears, but hopefully not as long as Xenogears.
Not as long as Xenogears, half as long as Xenogears,
Yes,
maybe.
but we hope that this is something you guys want, and so we're gonna give the people what they
What
want.
they want. They want Final Fantasy X. Thank you for joining us. We will see you again next week. Peace out, everybody.